Hi everyone, this is the start of 4.02 Money in the Bank 2, and we're starting with slide 1. Money is everywhere. Consumers use money in a variety of forms to buy the goods and services they want. Producers use money in the form of capital to acquire the resources they need, and workers are almost always paid with money. Every day, money is spent, saved, lost, and made. Without money, the world would be a very different place. Explore what money is and how it functions in the economy. You will step inside the U.S. banking system to see how it is structured and how it operates. And you will study the money supply to see how it is measured and controlled and learn about the forces that cause it to shrink and expand. Have you ever wondered how much money there is? One way to think about the money supply is the collection of all the currency, or coins and bills, in circulation. But the money supply actually includes much more than that, and the supply of money can grow or shrink without coins and bills being destroyed and created. How big is the money supply? The most common measure of the money supply includes only the most liquid forms of money. The concept of liquidity measures how quickly an asset can be turned into its cash value. The most liquid assets are the coins and bills minted by the government. Checking account balances and traveler's checks are also very liquid because they can be converted into cash almost instantly. A wider definition of the money supply includes less liquid forms of assets, such as savings account balances, debts people owe, and the property such as houses, cars, land, and jewelry. These assets are more difficult to turn into cash, but they are considered liquid because they can be converted to cash if needed. How big is the money supply? Just how liquid are these assets? Sort each asset into the appropriate column. Again, go ahead and do that on your own. Money creation. The money supply consists of liquid assets, but how does it grow? One might assume that the money supply grows only when the government issues new currency. But new currency is usually produced to replace the bills and coins that have worn out and must be removed from circulation. In fact, when the money supply grows, it is largely the result of banking activity. When banks hold only a small fraction of their total deposits and loan the rest of money out, they create new money. Here's an example of how it works. Suppose Jamal has $1,000, which he deposits into his checking account. According to the required reserve ratio, Jamal's bank must hold on to 10% of his deposit, or $100. The bank now has $900 in excess revenues, and to earn some interest, it loans the $900 to Katrina. When Jamal had the $1,000 in his pocket, it was already part of the money supply as currency in circulation. When he deposited the money in the bank, the money was removed from circulation, but since Jamal's checking account increased by $1,000, it remained part of the money supply. When the bank loaned $900 to Katrina, the 1,000 balance in Jamal's checking account didn't go down, so it's still part of the money supply. But Katrina now has $900 in her checking account. This $900 is part of the money supply. So the money supply has just increased by that amount. The $1,000 has turned into $1,000 plus 900. By making the loan, the bank created new money, increasing the money supply. Expanding and contracting the money supply. In the United States, the Fed tries to control the money supply to maintain a stable financial system and drive economic growth. When the Fed uses the money supply to manage the economy, it enacts monetary policy. By controlling the money supply, the Fed influences such things as interest rates and loan amounts. This, in turn, affects the entire economy. An expansionary monetary policy increases the money supply and drives economic growth. When the money supply expands, consumers have more money to spend. Businesses respond to increased sales by increasing production, which increases the demand for labor. A contractionary monetary policy, on the other hand, decreases the money supply and slows economic activity. Tools of monetary policy. The Fed uses three tools to affect the money supply: pushing it upward or downward to help control economic activity and manage economic growth. The first tool is to change the required reserve ratio. You have learned that this is usually around 10%, but the Fed can raise or lower it slightly if necessary. The second tool is to adjust the discount rate. The discount rate is a very low interest rate the Fed charges for overnight loans to banks that fall short of their required reserves. The third tool is the use of open market operations. This involves buying and selling Treasury bonds. Review the three tools of monetary policy before moving on to learn more about each one. The three tools of monetary policy: 1. The required reserve ratio. 2. The discount rate. 3. Open market operations. The required reserve ratio. The Fed can adjust the required reserve ratio to control the money supply. The Fed uses this tool sparingly, however, since banks rely on the stability of the required reserve ratio to know how much money to issue as loans. If the Fed increases the required reserve ratio, banks must keep a larger percentage of their deposits on hand in the vault. When banks do this, they loan less money. A decrease in the required reserve ratio by the Fed means that banks are able to loan more money. How does this affect the money supply? Remember, when banks make loans, they add money to the money supply. If banks loan more money, they add more to the money supply. And if they loan less money, they add less money to the supply, which keeps the money supply from growing. So increasing the required reserve ratio works to decrease the money supply, while decreasing the required reserve ratio works to increase the money supply. Review the main points about how the required reserve ratio influences the money supply. First, when the Fed increases the required reserve ratio, banks have fewer reserves to loan. Second, when banks have fewer reserves to loan, the money supply decreases. Third, when the Fed increases the required reserve ratio, it is pursuing a contractionary monetary policy. Fourth, on the other hand, when the Fed decreases the required reserve ratio, banks have more reserves to loan. When banks have more reserves to loan, the money supply decreases. When the Fed decreases the required reserve ratio, it is pursuing an expansionary monetary policy. The discount rate. The Fed also uses the discount rate to influence the money supply. Recall that the discount rate is the interest rate the Fed charges on overnight loans the bank needs to make up their required reserves at the end of the day. So when the Fed increases the discount rate on its overnight loan, banks will hold on to more of their reserves to avoid having to borrow from the Fed. What this means is that banks loan less of their deposits to make sure they meet their required reserves. If banks hold on to more of their excess reserves, they loan less and the money supply contracts. When the Fed decreases the discount rate, banks need to keep less of their reserves on hand because it is cheaper to borrow from the Fed if they need to. This leads banks to loan more and the money supply grows. Review how the discount rate influences money supply. When the Fed raises the discount rate, it makes it more expensive for banks to borrow from the Fed. When discount rates are higher, the banks are more likely to hold on to excess reserves. When the Fed raises the discount rate, it pursues a contractionary monetary policy. When the Fed lowers the discount rate, it is less expensive for banks to borrow from the Fed. When discount rates are lower, banks are more likely to loan excess reserves. When the Fed lowers the discount rate, it pursues an expansionary monetary policy. Open market operations. The Fed also controls the money supply by buying and selling high volumes of Treasury bonds, or T-bonds. T-bonds are financial instruments that the federal government uses to borrow money. Bonds are purchased by investors who give their money to the U.S. government. In exchange for the money, the government issues a bond, which is a promise to pay back the money with interest after a set period of time. Bonds are issued and sold by the U.S. Treasury. They are sold and resold continually on the open market. The Fed itself buys and sells T-bonds on the open market to affect money supply. But how does this work? Suppose you sell a $500 T-bond on the open market. If the Fed buys that T-bond, it adds $500 to your checking account, which adds $500 to the money supply. That $500 then generates excess reserves for your bank, which the bank can loan out, further increasing the money supply. The Fed can also take money out of the system by selling instead of buying. If you buy a $100 bond on the open market and that bond is one that the Fed is selling, then the Fed takes $100 out of your bank's deposits, which decreases your bank's reserves. Since the bank's reserves fall, it has less to loan out, which means the money supply decreases. Take a moment to review how changes in the Fed's open market operations influence the money supply. When the Fed buys bonds, it injects money into the economy and the money supply grows. When the Fed buys bonds, it pursues an expansionary monetary policy. When the Fed sells bonds, it removes money from the economy and the money supply shrinks. When the Fed sells bonds, it pursues a contractionary monetary policy. Money supply review. Do you think you understand the money supply? Do a quick review of the key concepts to make sure you haven't missed anything. The money supply can be measured in various ways. Usually, only the most liquid assets in the economy are counted, including currency in circulation, checking accounts, and traveler's checks. The fractional reserve banking system creates new money. Banks hold on to a smaller percentage of customer deposits and loan out the rest. When banks make loans, they create money that gets added to the money supply. The Fed uses the tools of monetary policy to influence the money supply in an attempt to keep the economy healthy. The three tools of monetary policy are changing the required reserve ratio, adjusting the discount rate, and using open market operations. And then you can check and see how well you know the money supply. So as always, let me know if you have any questions or concerns about any of this information. Have a great day.